Hi, everybody. Welcome to Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get a quick take on Denver's upcoming 420 event. According to its organizer, Miguel Lopez, it will be reminiscent of the Taste of Colorado, with performances and food vendors, minus the massive marijuana smoking of years past. Patty Calhoun, we have seen the 420 event go from a full-on protest to a rally, and now it's a reality. So can it become this Taste of Colorado event?
Well, the Waste of Colorado event is more like it. Look, they have a lot of music acts that are going to be really fun this year. They've brought in big name music acts. They're going to have vendors. It's going to be a fun party, but how you are going to get the people not to light up in the past? It is no more legal to light up or illegal to light up in the park now than it's been for decades. I mean, it is not legal to smoke dope in a park, but that hasn't stopped people in the past. So even though Rob Corey and Miguel Lopez have worked with the city to say we're not going to encourage it, that's a hard crew to keep dampened down.
Mike Krause, the Independence Institute, do you think the organizers have any hope of the attendees following what the organizers want to do?
You know, it certainly seems that in the past, what 420 really was a big act of civil disobedience, pushing towards this idea of our current partial decriminalization of possession of marijuana. And so whether or not they can continue that act of civil disobedience or whether or not they'll be able to suppress that act of civil disobedience will be interesting to see. However, if they do have the food vendors, I think if enough people show up stoned, they'll do very well. And the music might be secondary to that, but we'll have to see.
Just imagine what kind of music it's going to be. Eric Sonderman, analyst with SC2, what do you think?
I do think Taste of Colorado is the apt analogy. It's just a new taste, and it's a new Colorado with Amendment 64 and new laws in force. I think the civil disobedience or the protest, those days are gone. Now it's a party. That's what it was in my mind, largely up at CU for all these years. The pictures of the haze over downtown coming off of this, I'm not expecting that haze to go away, despite what some people might be saying in a few press releases. There'll be plenty of smoking going on.
Natasha Gardner, senior editor with 5280 magazine. Will the haze be replaced with maybe a 5280 best of vendors at the Waste of Colorado? I love Patty's idea.
Well, I like the idea of normalizing this. I mean, that's part of legalization, saying that this is fine and this is part of our society. So yes, it's there and it's a celebration and we're going to have fun. To say that there's not going to be people smoking is like saying there's Great American Beer Festival without beer or Food and Wine without wine. And this is a celebration of pot, and there will be pot there.
And probably lots of it. That's a very good point. The Secretary of State's office confirmed this week that Tom Tancredo turned in enough signatures to qualify for the GOP gubernatorial primary ballot. The Republican State Assembly is this weekend, and the final primary ballot will be affected now that Tancredo does not need to secure any delegates at the Assembly. Patty, assuming Bob Beaupre's signatures are all ratified, what do you think is going to come out of the Assembly happening tomorrow?
A really wild ride. You know, Scott Gessler's office has probably never moved as fast as it did trying to count those Tancredo signatures because, of course, Scott Gessler is one of the people who will benefit from the fact that Tom Tancredo doesn't need to get onto the ballot through the Assembly tomorrow. Instead, you're going to have Gessler and Greg Brophy and Mike Kopp and two others still fighting for as many spots as they can get. They've got to get 30% of the vote to get on the ballot. But depending on how it splits, and some of those top three could be fairly even, we could wind up having a ballot in June with 5 Republican candidates for governor. And it could almost be a replay of back in 1998 when Tom Tancredo was one of 5 candidates to run in the 6th congressional district and wound up taking it because he got the most votes in that incredibly crowded area. So this is good news for him, but it's also good news for someone else tomorrow because otherwise if Tancredo had been, they are going to get votes Tancredo would have taken away otherwise.
Mike, Patty's right. It could go mathematically. We could have 3 candidates come out of the assembly. We could have 1, and the likelihood of either one kind of goes really across the board. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, few things are more of a crapshoot than trying to prognosticate what Colorado Republicans will do in an assembly, given that Dan Mays got top billing last time around. Although I would say that if things follow the way that the polling went at the caucuses, I would guess that Scott Gessler ends up top billing, and then it's a battle between Mike Kopp and Greg Brophy. And of course, if you keep in mind that Greg Brophy has been all over this state and says he's hit all 64 counties in his Prius, and probably talked to every gun owner in Colorado, then he's got strong standing. And Mike Kopp, who doesn't have quite the ground game that Scott Gessler might have, or other candidates, but still is a well-respected name within the GOP and Republicans who are in the know, being a former state senator. So I would say Scott Gessler and then Greg Brophy and Mike Kopp battle it out for 2. Hard to say if it might be 3, but I would say those 2 guys battled out for second place.
Eric, I could be crazy, but I made the idea, or I came up with this idea yesterday that if Tancredo's not running for any delegates, it opens it up for somebody at the assembly. We think Gessler's going to take it, but he's not. He probably shouldn't take 71, so he's not going to eliminate a chance for somebody else. If it's a Brophy, if it's Kopp, maybe it's House or Sylvester, but if someone can get into that line, you have Gessler and Tancredo and Beaupre, kind of the heavy hitters Republican Party, and then possibly that 4th candidate, whether it's one of those lower tier candidates that might be able to make a claim to being the underdog and kind of ride that momentum. Am I nuts?
No, you're not nuts. I think it is a crapshoot tomorrow. You could end up with a 3-way primary. Let's assume, as your question does, that Bob Beaupre does get his signatures. His signatures are verified. So you have Tancredo and Beaupre petitioning on. I think most smart people in the Republican Party, some would suggest oxymoron, but most smart people in the Republican Party think that Gessler has his 30% plus some, probably top billing. So put Gessler on the ballot. Then let's say Scott Gessler gets 40% of the vote tomorrow. I'm just picking a number. So you have 60% left to split up between 4 other candidates. To get 30 out of 60 is not easy. So theoretically, you could have 3 people come out of there, but then you have to split it pretty fine to have 3 people all get 30% of the vote. That means some of the other candidates really get nothing at all, and those 3 are pretty equal. You could have only 1 come out of there, which presumably would be Gessler, but not for sure. The real good news here, I think Patty talked about this being, good news perhaps for Tancredo. The real good news is probably for John Hickenlooper and the Democrats, because the bigger the field is, in my mind, the increasing likelihood that you see a repeat of the situation Patty described, which is how Tom Tancredo won a seat in Congress that he inhabited for many years by winning a 5-way Republican primary with, my recollection, was 27% of the vote, maybe it was 29, but the first digit was a 2. And you have the same scenario here, and I don't think there are many people out there who really think that Tom Tancredo is going to sit in the governor's chair a year from now, that he's going to beat John Hickenlooper. John Hickenlooper would love to run against Tom Tancredo. The guy, John Hickenlooper, I don't know that he's afraid of any of them, but the one that he'd least like to run against is probably Mike Kopp, who they regard as having the most upside growth potential. We'll see in 24 hours.
Natasha, wrap it up for us. What do you think is going to happen on Saturday?
Well, what I think is interesting is that Republicans really shouldn't be worried about Saturday, but what happens after that. And ultimately, the end game is they have to have someone to run against Hickenlooper. And as they continue to have these battles and no one really comes out of the mix as a leader, or even 2 of them coming out as let's battle this out and see who's best for the state of Colorado, we have just about as big of a field as we did yesterday and as that we will have on Sunday. So it's kind of the same thing. I feel a lot of build up for tomorrow, but there's not going to be a lot of outcome. But the Republicans really have to focus in on who is going to be their candidate after that.
Let's move on. Denver District Court Judge Norman Haglund ruled this week in favor of Aurora's Gaylord Rockies Hotel and Conference Center in a lawsuit brought against them by a group of Denver hotels. The judge determined that the claims brought by the plaintiffs in the case had no standing, including wanting to overturn the $81.4 million award from the Colorado Economic Development Commission in 2012. Mike, this is just one of a couple battles that the Gaylord Hotel is facing, right?
Absolutely. Look, the Colorado Constitution in 3 different places bans public subsidy to private entities such as the Gaylord Hotel. In other words, it bans corporate welfare, no less than 3 times. And unfortunately, the legislature and the courts have ignored those bans for many years. And so it's actually important that this case, and I hope they appeal this ruling, because it's important this case gets some sunshine and that it be decided on its merits. Because keep in mind that it's not just the $80 million from Colorado taxpayers. There's Aurora taxpayers are on the hook for about $300 million in corporate welfare subsidies to the Gaylord Hotel in return for some house cleaning jobs, cleaning up after conventioneers' parties, and maybe cleaning some swimming pools. There is a second case, and the second case involves actual Aurora taxpayers who you would think have a much better chance at grabbing standing than the hotel chains do.
Eric, is this just going to exacerbate the feud between Denver and Aurora? Because if Aurora gets this hotel, that's a big deal. That could draw a lot. That's why these Denver hotels were involved in a lawsuit in the first place. What do you think this decision will do to the feud?
It just continues the feud. I don't believe we have. Are you an attorney, Mike, or?
We have an attorney-free CIO?
An attorney-free table. We ought to.
I play one at work.
We ought to bronze this thing. But so we have a table without attorneys, and maybe I'll play one briefly, but just for fake. My understanding of the judge's decision was not on its merits. It was a standing issue that the Denver hotels did not have standing to be plaintiffs. They did not have a grievance for the court to consider here. So it still leaves the issue ripe if there was somebody that the court determined did have standing. The real issue is the Colorado Economic Development Commission awarded this $81 million subsidy with one set of facts, and the facts changed. Everything on the ground has changed. And so the question is, if the facts on the ground change in a material way, I'm not talking about in a token way, can the ultimate decision change or not? And apparently the answer is not. I'm not sure that is totally healthy.
Natasha, this conversation started way back when it was even a proposal to put the stock show out there. They were thinking about making that part of it. That seemed to leave the table, but that was part of that initial discussion. I don't know all the different facts of the case, but it certainly has evolved. What do you make the latest development?
Well, I think the latest development proves that with an investment this big, both by the state, both by the counties, both by the neighboring, the impact that it's going to have on, say, Denver and the rest of the metro area, then we need to think about this. And that's what they're doing in the court system right now. But I think that as people have looked at it, there's still a conception that the stock show is involved. That is not the case. But people are confused by what exactly this proposal turned into. And I think until we get some clarity on that it's hard for the public to have an opinion on where it's going. I mean, at this point, Gaylord, Legoland, Disney World, it could all be the same. And actually, I might prefer those other ones instead.
I was going to say, you need to turn it all into here. If it's Legoland, that's a whole different ballgame. Patty, it started as stock show talks. Now it's a water park. Who knows what's going to be next? What do you think?
Well, the funny thing is, in its own way, the stock show is involved because Denver all of a sudden is going, and they want the a few changes in the Regional Tourism Authority rules. That is where they got the money for Gaylord, where Aurora got the money for Gaylord. Not because the city of Denver is fighting Aurora at this point, but because it wants to get some of that pot of money to update the National Western Stock Show complex, which is in northern Denver. And the reason that didn't go to Gaylord, even though I think the head of the stock show would have liked to, is because they forgot about that pesky 30-year contract they had with the city of Denver for these facilities. So all of a sudden, Denver is liking the idea of getting these subsidies from the state when they didn't like it when Gaylord was getting it. So we have a lot more legal fights going, and we're going to have some more fights in the legislature.
It should be fun to watch. Lynn Bartles of the Denver Post reported this week about developments in Governor Hickenlooper's bid to get an ethics complaint dismissed. The Colorado Independent Ethics Commission decided to not use a report from an investigator that it hired, deciding to only use transcripts from interviews. Eric, there's a lot here. The complaint itself, even Republicans, even John Suthers, Republican Attorney General, doesn't think a whole lot about the complaint. But the fact that it's out there, the fact that you can make negative ads about it, and this weird development seemed to raise a few eyebrows.
There is a lot out there about this. And as ethics go, there are serious ethical issues within governments across Colorado. I don't regard this as necessarily one of them. I think it's penny ante ethics. Somebody else around this table once described it as gotcha ethics, and that's the age we live in where both parties have their machines that file these ethics complaints. And I think it falls into that category. The whole issue of why the Ethics Commission would hire a private investigator and then not consider or use his findings, I don't quite get here. What is interesting about this week, Dominic, to me is, it strikes me that this is the week where John Hickenlooper, at least in my thinking, lost some of his Teflon. If you look at the press this week, and maybe that's been wearing off for a while, but there was this story that the Denver Post, which is a fairly friendly newspaper to Hickenlooper, they bannered it across the front page. There was a second banner across the front page of the Denver Post, that being about Referendum S, which was passed with Hickenlooper's urging a few years ago by the voters to change the state civil service system and what that has done to hiring and payroll costs and all that. That was another banner headline. Other publications have gone with the story about emails and private email accounts in the governor's office and the lack of being able to obtain emails through open records requests. You put it all together, this is a governor who has lost sort of the Teflon. I don't know, there's certainly an ad out there in the making for whoever the Republican candidate ends up being. But I think the real thrust is not the specifics of the ethics complaint. It's the notion of John Hickenlooper as sort of a more typical politician as opposed to this kind of anti-politician, which has been his brand ever since he first rode his scooter around Denver to get elected mayor.
Natasha, the ethics complaint hasn't had a lot of headlines, but like Eric was talking about, the process has now become the headlines. And for a lot of independent voters who are just kind of tuning in once in a while in between Dance with the Stars and American Idol, that's all it's going to take. They're not going to go into the fine print. But there's some weird things happening here if they're not using an investigator they hired, but the complaint's trying to get dismissed. What do you make of it?
I think that it's fair to borrow something from the justice system, and innocent until proven guilty. Investigations like this are troubling. They are worth investigating and figuring out what's happening, but I think it's very important for the media to look at it and say, okay, this is worth pursuing now. But then regardless of the verdict, regardless of whether that person is found responsible or not, we're going to cover it with the same amount of fervor that we did at the very beginning. And that's where it comes with the Dancing with the Stars mix, is that we owe it to the public to say this is an important issue. Yes, we're going to report on it, and you're going to stay with us because we want to know what happened with it. If we don't do that, then this conversation of why these are happening, why these ethic complaints are important, get lost both at the Capitol and for our average person.
Patty, is it just being exposed that the ethics complaint, claims from Republicans when it was all about Scott Gessler in the ethics complaint headlines that it was just a political weapon. And now we see Hickenlooper, and again, another complaint where people are like, but is the Ethics Commission just turned into more of a political weapon than actually investigating serious problems?
Well, I have to say, if you look through both this one and the Scott Gessler case, they are not that serious problems. It's great to have an ethics commission, but it would be nice if they did their job. I mean, if you look through this investigator's report, his draft report is all of 5-6 pages, and they're goofy. I mean, it's goofy. He has much longer transcripts that are interviews with some of Hickenlooper's staff where he calls Alan Salazar. He says, "You're a slippery lot." I mean, it's very entertaining reading, but it does not seem particularly professional. In contrast, the report on Gessler is probably 5 times as long with lots of documents attached. So you can see why they used that one and maybe why they decided not to use this one. But you really wonder, aren't there better ways that the Ethics Commission can really handle these complaints and run things and spend as much time and energy as they are on things that once they've seen the light of day, you can say it's really not a violation. We're glad you're watching out for this, but can we just go on with governing the state?
Exactly. Mike, this all comes down to Amendment 41. I think a law that looked really good to voters when it was passed. We're going to stop ethics problems, but it's certainly been used as a weapon. What do you make of the latest developments we saw this week?
Well, the Independent Ethics Commission likes to hold itself out with the gravitas of an actual court of law. But as Colorado statesman columnist Miller Hudson recently said, it's a kangaroo court, if anything. And the IEC seems to have this habit of adapting and customizing its rules of procedure, rules of evidence, and rules of due process to each individual case, often based on the party affiliation of the person the complaint has been filed against. And if you look at the difference between the media coverage, not just the media coverage and the degree of documentation and evidence that was brought to bear against Scott Gessler versus what has been brought to bear against John Hickenlooper, that starts to bear itself out. It seems to me that if the IEC is looking for a way to dismiss a case, they have the ability to find it, just as they have the ability to find someone guilty of an ethics complaint. Now, what happens after that is the bigger question, because if this complaint is dismissed against John Hickenlooper, that's a great campaign commercial. Those John Hickenlooper's enemies tried to drag him through the mud, but the independent ethics commission cleared him of any wrongdoing, but not Scott Gessler, who was found to be guilty of an ethics violation. And so if this thing is dismissed, it's great fodder for the Hickenlooper administration coming up into the campaign. If by some bizarre happenstance they happen to find him guilty of some ethics violation, then he basically gets the same red scarlet stamped on his forehead that Scott Gessler has. And so now they can, if it ends up Scott Gessler and ends up on the ticket, you know what, they can throw that at each other and we'll see what'll stick.
If Gessler's the nominee, I think you should get some sort of fee for writing the commercial, because I think you even did a great voiceover for it. So that was good stuff. A proposal that would ban red light cameras was introduced in the legislature this week. Some legislators support the ban, citing it merely creates revenue for cities without protecting its residents. Other lawmakers are concerned that removing the street cameras would make it harder to monitor the hit and run activity that seems to plague Colorado. Natasha, are we thinking about two different problems? I mean, we need red light cameras so we can try to find out what's happening to hit and run accidents. I mean, this seems like odd argumentation.
Oh, it is maybe putting two things together. The hit and run problem in Colorado is very serious. We passed the Medina Alert, which uses the groundswell of people to give information and tips on people who might have been involved in a hit and run. That's extremely important. Red light cameras, more annoying than important. I mean, I think that people who go through that, you know, if I'm at an intersection with a red light camera and it's there, I don't go creep into the intersection. I probably am a better driver. But it's certainly an issue where we wouldn't be making so much money off of it. This wouldn't be in the Capitol this year talking about it if they weren't making so much money off of it. But that's because we're bad drivers. That has nothing to do with the red light cameras. However, there are some independent groups that have looked at the red light cameras, questioning whether they actually cause accidents, whether they're actually effective. And I'm surprised that the legislature isn't looking a little bit more into that. That seems like a good use of their time, instead of right off saying, let's take this money out of our budget. We don't really need it. I don't think that's ever the case in Colorado.
Patty, where are you at on this?
Well, as with photo radar, there have been concerns that the red light cameras do cause more trouble, more problems when there weren't. There are some legality issues. So I think if the legislature really wants to look at it and say, now's not the time to have these, let's get rid of them, you could justify that. You don't want to really get into the hit and run argument at the same time, because there are better ways to deal with hit and run, like really patrol the drivers who are on the roads. If they're stopped, they're not hitting anybody.
That's very true. Mike, what do you think? Is this just a big boondoggle, a cash cow for cities?
Well, in many ways, the red light cameras, and by the way, there's an emerging scandal that started in Chicago involving one of these red light camera companies, where there was payola going on to get their system installed as opposed to the other corporations' system installed. And keep in mind that these are for-profit corporations that operate these systems, so there's actually an incentive to have as dangerous an intersection as possible where these red light cameras are, to generate as many tickets as possible, because these companies need to be profitable because they're private corporations. And then the municipalities get addicted very quickly to the revenue. And in fact, Reason Magazine has done extensive work on red light cameras, and there's actually been 6 American cities, none in Colorado, where it was found that red light cameras were placed at intersections, and then the yellow light cycle was actually shortened to get as many people as possible actually blowing red lights. Wow. And so one of the ways, and Patty brought it up about making intersections safer, you can actually extend yellow light cycles first, before you install red light camera systems, to try and make them safer. Now, with regard to the Medina Alert, keep in mind that is a public notification system. This red light system ban shouldn't have anything to do with the Medina system. And keep in mind that the case that brought that forward was a cab driver following a hit and run driver, not a red light camera catching him.
Eric, wrap it up for us.
Just quickly, I flash back on a book. It was formative for me 20 years ago, called The Death of Common Sense. That's what strikes me as what this is about. clearly, if somebody's blowing through a red light, I'm all in favor of using whatever technology to catch them, bring them to justice, fine them, all the rest. But often it is used for somebody whose wheels are just, hanging over the line, and they get the same treatment as the same fine as the guy who blew through the red light. Government ought to be able to have some discretion and judgment and distinguish between the two.
2 minutes left. Disgrace of the week. Patty, start us off.
Young mother in Evans whose death was ruled suicide death, and now, thanks to really good work by a Fox reporter, bad work it looks like by the Evans Police Department, that whole case has been reopened, and her husband, who has taken her 3 children out of state, is under suspicion.
Mike?
The Jefferson County Teachers Union, which staged what is pretty obviously a pre-planned walkout of collective bargaining negotiations this week to a podium and microphone, which was conveniently set up so they could announce their reasons for walking out.
Eric?
The Reverend Al Sharpton, I don't care if he was a mob informant or not back in the 80s. I really don't care. What's interesting about the story is the White House logs of what a frequent visitor he is to this White House. Here's somebody who's a charlatan, he's a fraud, he's a race baiter of the worst kind. But he is an integral part of this White House. He was at Michelle Obama's 50th birthday party. He had a seat at the state dinner when the President of France was visiting, etc. The White House ought to have a little more judgment here.
Natasha?
The proposed alcohol ban in Washington Park, it just doesn't really make sense when you already have so many rules on the books for disorderly conduct, for littering, for all these things that they're concerned about. There might be better ways to attack the issue.
And I'll join in quickly with the Denver cop who didn't allow that neighbor to move that dog that was hit by the car, just sat there on the street for 90 minutes waiting for animal control to show up. There's, like you said, the death of common sense. Say something nice very quickly, Patty.
Doors Open Denver, it's 10th edition, and the Denver Architectural Foundation that really stepped up when the city pulled back and is keeping it going.
Mike?
The Colorado Senate committee that killed the cyberbullying bill, which was, while well-intended, was obviously a violation of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Nice job. Hard to do.
Eric?
A personal note, my son, Clark Sonderman, turned 18 yesterday, celebrated in New Zealand where he finished up a 3-month wilderness program. He's rocking it.
Nice. Natasha?
Last weekend I watched the women's national soccer team play in Denver, and that was really exciting. We also had Equal Pay Day this week, and just have to applaud women who have been fighting for women's rights over the decades. It's pretty incredible.
Capped off with UConn winning an undefeated season again.
Good week.
Amen to that. That's all the time we have tonight. Thanks for tuning in. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching. Good night.